It is a funny thing, gardening. You can spend years doing something, almost on autopilot, because you know it works. For me, that something was mulching with compost. Every autumn, like clockwork, I would spread a thick, dark blanket of my homemade compost over every bare inch of soil in my borders. It was a ritual, the final act of putting the garden to bed for winter. But a couple of years back, a particularly busy season and a shortage of well-rotted material meant I skipped it. It'll be fine for 1 year, I told myself. It was, I now realize, the biggest mistake I've made in my garden for a very long time. It was an unintended experiment, and the results were stark and immediate. The first signs of trouble came with the following spring. Usually my soil is a delight to work with after winter. It is dark, crumbly, and teeming with life. I can plunge a fork into it with satisfying ease. This time, however, it was different. The soil felt, reluctant. It was paler in color, and when I dug into it, it was less forgiving, more compacted. The life-giving, friable structure I had taken for granted was noticeably diminished. It was as if the very heart of the garden had lost some of its vigor, its rhythm slightly out of step. The soil was not dead by any means, but it was certainly sulking. Then came the first dry spell of late spring. Normally, my compost mulch acts like a great sponge, soaking up the rain and holding it in the soil for the plants to draw upon when they need it. It keeps the surface from baking hard under the sun. Without this protective layer, the ground cracked and gaped alarmingly quickly. After just a few days without rain, the surface was baked to a hard, impenetrable crust. The moisture that was in the soil evaporated into the air far faster than it should have, leaving the ground beneath thirsty and stressed. It was a visual and tactile lesson in the importance of that simple, insulating layer. My plants, of course, were the first to truly protest. They began to wilt much sooner than I was used to seeing. The herbaceous perennials, which normally stood proud and strong, started to droop their heads by midday, even on moderately warm days. The tender annuals I had just planted out looked particularly sorry for themselves, their leaves flagging as they struggled to draw enough water from the rapidly drying soil. I found myself reaching for the watering can far more often, trying to compensate for what the mulch would have done naturally. It was more work, and it felt like I was fighting a losing battle against the sun and wind. The lack of a compost mulch did more than just affect moisture levels. It was an open invitation for every opportunistic weed seed in the vicinity. Normally, my thick layer of compost smothers the majority of annual weeds, preventing their seeds from germinating by blocking out the light. It is one of the great benefits of the practice, saving me hours of back-breaking work. But that year, without the compost blanket, the soil surface was bare and exposed. It was a perfect seedbed and the weeds knew it. They arrived with a vengeance, seemingly overnight, creating a fine green carpet where I wanted to see dark, bare earth. The competition was fierce. Hairy bittercress, chickweed, and groundsel sprung up in dense colonies, their roots robbing my chosen plants of precious water and nutrients. I spent countless hours on my hands and knees, teasing them out with a hand fork, but it was a relentless task. For every weed I pulled, 2 more seemed to spring up in its place. The garden, which was usually a place of creative joy, started to feel like a battlefield. The weeds were winning, and my ornamental plants were visibly suffering from the constant struggle for resources. It was a clear demonstration of how mulch is not just a nicety, but a fundamental part of low-maintenance gardening. Beneath the surface, an even more worrying change was taking place. When I did find a moment to dig, I noticed a distinct lack of my underground allies, the earthworms. My soil is usually writhing with them, their tunnels aerating the ground and their casts enriching it. That year, they were few and far between. The hard, dry, and compacted soil surface was not an inviting habitat for them. Worms thrive in the cool, moist, organic-rich environment that a compost mulch provides. Without it, they had either burrowed deeper to escape the conditions, or their populations had simply declined. It was a silent but deeply concerning symptom of the soil's failing health. This decline in soil life had a knock-on effect on the soil's structure. It became sad, a heavy lifeless substance that was difficult to work. The intricate web of microbial life, the fungi and bacteria that break down organic matter and release nutrients, was also suffering. Healthy soil is a living, breathing ecosystem, and I had effectively starved it of its primary food source and removed its protective shelter. The result was a soil that locked up its nutrients, was prone to compaction, and struggled to hold water. It was a classic case of taking a healthy system and breaking it, simply by omitting one crucial step. As the season progressed, the overall health of my plants was clearly compromised. They were not just thirsty, they were weaker. Growth was noticeably less vigorous than in previous years. The delphiniums were shorter, the roses produced fewer, smaller blooms, and the foliage on my hostas lacked its usual luster. It was as if the entire garden was growing in slow motion, putting all its energy into mere survival rather than a glorious, abundant display. The plants looked stressed, their leaves often taking on a slightly yellowish tinge that spoke of nutrient deficiency. They were simply not getting the slow, steady feed that a decomposing compost mulch provides throughout the year. This general weakness made them a prime target for pests and diseases. Nature is very good at spotting a weakness, and the aphids certainly did. They descended on the soft new growth of my roses and lupins in numbers I hadn't seen for years. A healthy, strong-growing plant is much more capable of shrugging off an attack from a few pests, but my weakened plants were quickly overwhelmed. I also saw more black spot on the roses and mildew on the phlox. It was a classic chain reaction. Poor soil led to weak plants, and weak plants were unable to defend themselves. The difference was not just in the flowers, but in the entire presence of the plants. They lacked that essential robustness, that look of vitality that is the hallmark of a happy plant in a healthy garden. They looked thin and spindly, as if they were stretching for light and life, but could not quite find it. This was not the joyful, generous, and overflowing garden I was used to. It was a garden that was struggling, and it was entirely my own doing. The simple act of withholding their annual compost feed had turned them from thriving specimens into vulnerable patients, and it was a sorry sight to behold. Even the simple act of walking through the garden felt different. It lacked the lushness, the sense of a space brimming with life. Instead of a sense of abundance, there was a feeling of scarcity. The flowers were less vibrant, the foliage was less dense, and the whole atmosphere was one of struggle rather than celebration. It was a profound lesson. A garden is not just a collection of individual plants. It is a complex community, and it all starts with the soil. By neglecting the soil, I had neglected the very foundation of the entire system, and the evidence was all around me. That autumn, I was not going to make the same mistake twice. I made sure I had a huge, steaming pile of my best homemade compost ready. It was dark, crumbly, and smelled sweet and earthy, the scent of pure garden gold. As I barrowed it load by load to the borders, I felt a sense of relief, of righting a wrong. The process of spreading it felt like an apology to the soil and the plants. I applied it generously, laying it at least 2 inches thick over every patch of bare earth, carefully working around the crowns of the herbaceous perennials and the stems of the shrubs. The garden immediately looked better, tucked up under its new, dark brown blanket. The transformation the following spring was nothing short of miraculous, and it came quickly. The soil, when I first put a fork to it, had regained its beautiful, crumbly texture. It was dark and moist, and a single spadeful revealed a healthy population of earthworms that had returned to work their magic near the surface. The hard, cracked crust of the previous year was a distant memory. Instead, the soil was receptive and easy to work, a clear sign that the organic matter was already being incorporated, and the soil ecosystem was bouncing back to life with vigor and a renewed sense of purpose. As the plants began to grow, they did so with a strength and vitality that had been sorely missing. The new shoots on the perennials were thicker and greener, and they grew with a confidence that was palpable. The roses burst into leaf, their foliage a deep glossy green, free from the pale, anemic look of the previous season. Everything just looked happier and healthier. The slow, steady release of nutrients from the decomposing compost was giving them exactly the feed they needed, precisely when they needed it. The constant need for watering was also greatly reduced, as the mulch was now doing its job of conserving moisture in the soil. The weeds, thankfully, were back under control. The thick layer of compost had smothered the overwintering seeds, and very few managed to push their way through. The little weeding I had to do was a quick and easy job, rather than the relentless chore it had been. The pests also seemed to have backed off. The healthier, more robust plants were far less appealing to the aphids, and the black spot and mildew were much less of a problem. The garden was healing itself. It was a powerful and humbling reminder that the best way to garden is often to work with nature, to feed the soil, and to let the soil do the work for you. Over the years, I have refined my composting and mulching method to a simple, effective routine. For me, the key is to apply the mulch once a year, in autumn. This is when the borders are being cleared, herbaceous perennials are being cut back, and there is plenty of bare soil to cover. Applying it in autumn allows the winter worms to begin the process of dragging the organic matter down into the soil, improving its structure long before the spring growing season begins. It also provides a protective blanket for the plant roots and soil life against the worst of the winter cold and wet. When I apply the compost, I am generous with it. There is no point in a thin, mean-spirited sprinkling. You need a good, thick layer. I aim for a depth of at least 2 to 3 inches, or about 5 to 7 centimeters. For a new bed, or one with particularly poor soil, I might even go a little thicker. I pile it on with a spade or a shovel, straight from the wheelbarrow, and then spread it out evenly with a rake or just with my hands. It is important not to pile the mulch right up against the woody stems of shrubs or the crowns of perennials, as this can trap moisture and encourage rot. Leave a small, clear collar of an inch or so around them. The type of compost is important, but you do not need to be too precious. The best is your own, homemade garden compost, as it will be full of the microbes and life from your own garden. However, well-rotted manure, leaf mold, or a good-quality peat-free multi-purpose compost bought in bags will also do the job splendidly. The crucial thing is that it is well-rotted and has a fine, crumbly texture. You are not just covering the soil, you are feeding it. This annual application is all my borders get. I do not use any other chemical fertilizers. This single mulch provides all the nutrients my plants need for the entire year. Ultimately, this single act of mulching with compost is the most important thing I do to ensure my garden is healthy, resilient, and low maintenance. It feeds the soil, which in turn feeds the plants. It suppresses weeds, conserves water, and improves the soil's structure year after year. My unintentional experiment of skipping it for a season taught me a lesson I will never forget. A garden without a compost mulch is a garden that is working too hard. By giving back to the soil, you create a virtuous cycle that results in a stronger, more beautiful garden that brings joy rather than endless work.